Hello everyone. Yes, you're seeing the title correctly. I'm actually doing a tutorial for once. So Celsys has generously sponsored this video for me to do a tutorial for their program, Paint, which I have been using for around 3 years now. It's been my main drawing program on PC ever since, and I've actually upgraded from Pro to X recently because I wanted to learn how to animate on it, and that's been pretty enjoyable so far too. And I'm gonna walk you through a lot of the tools that I use and also the basics of Paint. And I'm just gonna try my best, so wish me luck. Hopefully this video isn't confusing and can actually help some of you understand things better. So getting into it, first things first, I want to customize the interface because the interface is probably one of the most intimidating parts about using a new program. And I know it's definitely what scared me away the first time I tried to use Paint. So let's get that out of the way. So I've gone and reset my interface for the sake of this video, and hopefully this is actually what the default looks like aside from maybe my brushes, so you can follow along if you want. So I'm gonna drag these extra tabs and actually close them because I just don't need them right now. And a lot of this stuff you can get back on the Windows tab by checking it on. At the end of that, your Windows tab should look something like this, where these are the things that are checked. So you should have a layer window, navigator, color wheel, tool property, and subtool window. These are the essentials of digital art making. You could also resize them by putting your mouse in between the windows until it looks like this, and you can just click and drag. You can drag these and move them to wherever you want. I like my color wheel to be up here and my navigator in the middle over here. So that's your windows. These are personally what I think are the 5 essential windows. You can bring back your brush size in case you like to change your brush size this way. I like to just use this right here, or I hold Ctrl-Alt to change my brush size. You also have all these other color wheel options and tabs that you can bring back. But I personally only use the color set and color wheel. I put my color set right underneath my color wheel. Another useful thing with the windows is that every single one actually has these 3 lines right here which will open up menus for that specific window. So this view option will change how the brushes are presented, either as a stroke or a tile. You could even change the size of the tile. I'm going to keep it as a stroke. I've also gotten questions on how to hide the title of these brush tabs to make it more condensed. All you have to do is click those 3 lines and uncheck Show Group Name of Subtool, and it'll clean up your tabs without the words. So now that we've cleaned up our windows, let's clean up some of these bars that are around here. This up here is the command bar. It's useful for shortcuts that you might misplace. I personally don't use it, so I like to hide it. I think if you're a beginner, you could probably keep it because it'll be useful for you. These other bars here, this is the materials bar. You could just hide it by clicking these 2 arrows. And down here are the animation tools, so you can just hide that too if you don't animate. You could always bring it back by clicking those 2 arrows again. Those 2 arrows are also on the window bars, so you could hide and minimize them if you want. Alternatively, if you want them all to go away at the same time, you can just press tab and then tab again to bring them back. This window bar and this bar up here, you can also hide them by pressing Shift Tab. Shift Tab again, and then Shift Tab a 3rd time brings them back. So the Paint interface is actually very, very customizable. Go and do what you want with it. And now that your interface is how you want it, let's go make a canvas. So let's go to File and New. It'll open up this handy dandy window here. The first thing I make sure is checked is record time lapse. if you want Clip Studio Paint to automatically record time lapses like Procreate does, check this box. If this window pops up, just press OK. This will usually save whenever you make a new canvas with it checked on, but just in case, just make sure that it is on if you want to record time lapses automatically. My go-to canvas size when I draw is usually paper size or higher, so 8.5 by 11 inches. So I have to go here and change the unit from pixels to inches, and then set the width to 8.5 by 11. I also set my DPI to 300 or higher so that if I ever want to print my art, it will be high quality. Clip Studio Paint also has these built-in templates made for things like comics and animations. They also have size presets that you can choose from, and you could always save your own preset using this button right here. And that's how you make a new canvas. Every time you make a new canvas, it'll save the last settings that you use. So if I go to File, New again, it'll show what I had before. So your canvas might have a ruler, but mine doesn't. That's because I hid mine. You could hide your ruler by pressing Ctrl R, and then you can bring it back by pressing Ctrl R again. Or you can go to the View tab and uncheck ruler bar or check it. I personally don't like to use the ruler, so I keep it hidden. And to get more of these brush groups to organize your brushes, all you have to do is drag them and it'll create a new tab. You can move the brushes back and forth by doing the same thing. As you can see here, I have a bunch of different brushes. I've bought them online, I've made some myself, or I've gotten them from the Clip Studio Assets store. So one of the best parts about Clip Studio is their assets store, which you can access either through your browser or the built-in store in the Clip Studio window. Here you could see a bunch of materials that you can download and use for your program. For example, this brush looks interesting, so I'm going to click on it. It'll start downloading, and you could also see the progress of the download on this bar right here. Once that's finished, I'm going to go back to Clip Studio Paint and unhide the materials bar. It'll be in my downloads folder, and this is the brush. I'll just click and drag that brush onto my subtool window. If you're unsure where your materials tab is, you can always go to Window, Material, Material Download, and it'll pop up for you. Alternatively, you could also edit pre-existing brushes by selecting a brush, going to the Windows tab, and pulling up your subtool detail window. This will open and you could edit all of these settings to whatever you like. The thing that a lot of people might miss though is this small button right here next to a lot of settings, which changes how it interacts with pressure sensitivity. So go and mess around and make your own brushes. Before diving into my process walkthrough, I'm going to highlight some tools that I find really useful, like tonal correction, correction layers, liquify, brightness to opacity, and textures. I'm just going to explain those hopefully quickly, but if you just want to get to the drawing process, feel free to skip using video chapters. So first up is tonal correction, which you can access by going to the Edit tab. And all the way down here is tonal correction, and there are all of these options that you can choose to change the colors and values of your layer. So this is the piece that I drew for this video. If I chose brightness and contrast, I can change how bright it is and how much contrast it has. There are some basic ones that you can use just to adjust, like brightness, saturation, and even a poster filter. Level correction, tone curve, and color balance are more advanced versions of color correction basically. Tone curve allows you to adjust the values in a more complicated way, as well as the color balance. Gradient map allows you to choose from either presets or create your own in adjusting the colors of certain values of your layer. Personally, I love to use gradient maps, but I like to use them using correction layers. So while tonal corrections are applied to the actual layer itself and changes it, correction layers are basically tonal corrections in the form of a separate layer, rather than permanently affecting the specific layer you're wanting to change. You can access correction layers by going to Layer and New Correction Layer, and here you can see all the same tonal correction options. So if I choose gradient map, it'll create a new gradient map correction layer, which I can then use to change the colors on my piece slightly without having to affect the actual layer. You can edit the opacity of correction layers, and you can also change their layer mode to create some cool effects. You can also clip these correction layers and apply layer masks to them. Liquify is a tool down here that lets you manipulate your layer in multiple ways. You can push, expand, pinch, and even twirl your layer. You can change the brush size and strength as well as the hardness of the effect that you get. I always like to use Liquify as one of my final steps for finishing touches. Brightness and opacity is also another useful tool that can really help in certain situations. Basically what it does is convert lighter values in a layer into transparent pixels. So if you accidentally did your line art, like on your sketch layer for example, you can save it by using the brightness to opacity. The thing that it does though is turns the layer to black and white, so just be wary of this if you ever use this on a colored layer. Textures is also a really fun thing to mess around in this program. Clip Studio Paint already has a bunch of built-in materials in the monochromatic patterns tab in the materials. So you can just take one of those and drag it onto your canvas. It will create its own textured layer. In this textured layer, you can go to its layer properties and check on overlay texture, and it will do the work for you. You can manipulate the size of the pattern and move it if you use the operation tool. Also, Clip Studio Paint 2.0 has launched recently, which has a bunch more useful tools. It has a free trial available for 3 months on Windows, so go check that out if you're interested and you don't already own the program. Personally, I haven't upgraded yet because I feel like I'm good with the tools that I have currently. So I'm still using version 1. Honestly, I might do the 2.0 3-month trial just to try out the new features. But aside from the free trial, if you already own version 1 like I do, you can also get a discount for the one-time purchase upgrade to version 2. So if that's something that you're considering doing, make sure to get that discount. And now with all that over with, I'm finally gonna get into my actual drawing process. So I'm gonna play footage of me drawing, and I'm gonna slow it down at certain points to explain what I'm actually doing, what tools I'm using. And of course, I'll be starting by making a new canvas. This time around, I'm using 350 dpi with a 6x6 inch canvas. I'm using 350 because this piece is going to be a print in my store, and when I work on prints, I like to go over 300 dpi just to be a little safer with print quality. For this piece, I also brought back my sub-view window, which you could find in your Windows tab. It'll pop up for you. You could use this to import any image you want and use it as a reference, which you can also color pick from. So now that I have my character reference in my sub-view window and also my canvas is set, I'm ready to start drawing, and I begin by sketching with a very thick brush. The one that I'm using is called Brittle Pencil from my Clip Studio Paint pack, which you could buy and find in the description if you're interested in getting my brushes. I just like to use a thick brush because it helps me commit to my drawing strokes a lot better than if I was using a thin, low opacity brush. So if you watch my background and foreground color, you're going to see that I'm constantly switching from the foreground color to the transparent tool. And that is because I use that to erase instead of the actual eraser tool. Honestly, I just like how it makes the brush that you're already using turn into an eraser. And right now you can see that I'm adjusting my sketch using the transform tool, which is Ctrl-T, I think, by default. And that is how I rearrange things within the same layer pretty much all the time. And that's also how I resize things. And I'm also constantly flipping my canvas by pressing my hotkey, which is H. H is just what I changed it to, so I'm not sure what the default is, but you can always flip your canvas using the buttons on your navigation window or on your command bar if you chose to keep your command bar on your interface. You might also notice that I never rotate my canvas, and that is honestly just because I'm too lazy. But on the off chance that I do rotate my canvas, I just use the buttons on my navigation window instead of my shortcut because my hands just aren't used to doing the shortcut since I never use it. And also here I use the liquify tool that I mentioned earlier to quickly adjust my character's cheek. It just helps like during the times where you can't seem to draw a line the exact way that you want it, so just adjust it using the liquify. And from here on out, it's pretty straightforward with the sketch. I do a few transformations here and there, and I'm pretty much done with the sketch until we get to lining. I also like to section things out sometimes with a sketch, so the face and body will be together on one layer, and then the hair and like the ears will be on another layer. And this just helps in case I don't like how the hair turned out, then I can redo it. Or if I didn't like how the face turned out, and I can redo that separate from the hair. So to prepare for lining, I have this folder that I have my sketch layers in. I'm going to select the folder and head on over to my layers property tab, which I have here, or you could access it in your Windows tab. And then I choose layer color, which allows me to change the color of the entire group. And then I make a new folder, which is going to have my line art layers in it. With layers and folders, you can label them with colors by using this button right here. This is the way that I like to label my folders rather than naming them one by one. It's just the way my brain works. So for lining, I like to use this brush that I made called the everything brush. I call it everything brush because I really do use it for everything except maybe sketching. I use it for lining and coloring and of course overpainting. If you want this brush, it is pay what you want, so you can definitely get it for free, or you can choose to compensate me if you would like. I've sometimes gotten questions where people like wonder how my brush size is so big, yet when I actually draw, the brush doesn't seem as big as the preview, and it's because I don't apply that much pressure. So if you're wanting to use this brush and you want it to look like how it looks when I use it, you're gonna have to apply less pressure. Basically, have a lighter hand when you use this brush. Just like the sketch, I work on the hair on a separate layer than the skin and body. And that's because I tend to be much more messy when it comes to lining the hair. You could definitely see it. It is a lot more messy. And I don't care much for clean line art at this stage because I do a lot of adjustments after coloring. For accessories like the leaves in her hair, I also tend to do those on a separate layer. So now that my line art is finished, I actually take that group and I duplicate it to have a backup. And in the copy of the group, I merge the layers together. And then I use my pin light trick on the line art before coloring, which is just duplicating that line art layer, selecting that bottom layer, alpha locking it, and then coloring it some type of reddish color. Then I set that bottom layer to pin light, and I clip the top layer, which is still black, to that bottom layer, and it just creates this like tinted look to your line art. And if that just sounds very confusing, I also go over it in my coloring process video, and I have a tutorial on it on my pinned reel on Instagram. This just adds a very slight tint of whatever color you chose underneath your black lines. And I really love the look that this gives to a piece, because even if you keep your lines black, it just adds like a pop to it. But the best thing about this for my process is that it helps me choose colors later on, because I can just color pick from that very slight tint. So when it comes to actually blocking in colors or doing flats, I tend to use the micron brush, and I just make it gigantic and then I color it in manually, because the way that I do my lines, they're so messy that the magic wand tool doesn't like it, and the fill bucket tool also doesn't like my lines because there's a lot of gaps in there. Some artists have created this tool on Celsys Paint assets that fills in some of that gap for you, and it does it like automatically. But my liner is still so messy that it still misses the spot sometimes. Recently, my friend actually told me about a quick fill select tool, which just quickly fills what you've selected. And at the time that I'm recording this voiceover, it's actually what I've started to use as my main way of doing flats. But most of the time, if you do cleaner line art than me, the magic wand tool, bucket tool, or the quick fill tool that you could find on the Clip Studio Assets store will work pretty well for you. And what I'm doing now is basically just laying down my flats. I like to section these out with whatever is convenient, like just hair or skin. And then clothes is possibly a third layer. I also tend to do the whites of the eyes and the color of the eyes on separate layers that are clipped onto the skin. And then once I get to shading, there's actually a lot of different brushes that I use, but for this video, I'm using the pencil art brush, which, like everything else that I'm using in this video, will be linked in the description. I do all the shading on the same one as the flats of the skin, except I alpha lock it. I used to do this on a layer that is clipped onto the skin, but lately I've just been feeling like it saves some time to just do it all on the same layer to begin with. Once the rough shading on the skin is done, I just go and do the same thing to the hair, once again on the same layer except alpha locked. Now I'm changing the color of my line art by alpha locking that black layer that is clipped onto the pinlight layer. I do this to help with rendering later on. Once all that rough shading is finished, I create a top layer above everything above the lines, and then I just go in and I start overpainting. This overpainting step is very similar to just painting in real life, where everything you add on is on top of what you've already done. You're cleaning things up, you're covering mistakes, and it's up to you to just do whatever you want during this step, honestly. The main thing that I do is I cover up a lot of that black line art and I just render over it. I add some shading here and there, and it's just something that I can't really go into too much detail about. Otherwise, this video would be an hour long, but I do have a video where I explain it a little bit more during a draw with me. But one thing I will talk about is how much I actually color pick during this step, and how that pinlight technique from before with the line art really comes in handy. With color picking, I think the shortcut is Alt, and it just turns into the color pick tool whenever you're holding Alt. When I zoom in, I can go into those tiny pixels on my line art and choose from the colors that the pinlight technique creates. And I constantly use those colors to help when choosing which ones to use when I overpaint. As you can see here, I've done a bunch of overpainting already, but everything I did has been on that same layer that I created. Sometimes I do create multiple layers for overpainting, but this time around it all stayed on the same layer. Here I'm aiming to clean up some of those edges, and I actually use a layer mask on the entire group to do this. Layer masks just let you go in and hide whatever you want by manipulating that layer, and the transparency tool comes really handy with this. So instead of going through all those layers and cleaning them up underneath the overpainting, I can just select the entire group, apply a mask to it, and manipulate the mask because it affects everything already. So I have my background layer here that is underneath that entire group that my drawing is on, and I'm gonna use the tonal correction hue saturation to just kind of mess around and see what different colors might look as a background. And then as I experiment with what the background might be, I start to add more layers as I introduce more colors into it. I personally struggled with the background for this piece, so you might see a lot of experimentation going on because I initially just wanted it to be green, but then it felt boring and I started like really messing around with what I could include in the background. I also like to use grids and screen tones in my art a lot. And Celsys Paint has built-in screen tones that you can choose from if you go to your materials tab, the monochromatic patterns, and it will be in the basic, and you could just click and drag those into your piece. It'll create a layer for itself, and you can even go into the layer properties and edit all the different parameters that it has to what you want. What I end up doing with this green tone layer is clipping it onto those yellow circles that you can see, and I'm using the layer color in the layers property to change the color of it. So when I finally created a background that I was somewhat content with, I saw that I had all these layers that weren't grouped, and what I do is select all of them and right click, and you could group them together. This is when I do my final touches using mainly correction layers. I have this trick that I started to do where I take a brightness and contrast correction layer. I set the contrast to 25, and then I clip that onto my drawing and I set it to the layer mode saturation. And depending on how that looks, I edit the opacity to 50, maybe more or less. What this trick does is just make the saturation pop in the drawing a little bit more. Sometimes it can look a bit extreme though, and that is where the opacity comes in handy. And here I'm actually using a hue and saturation correction layer to mess around and see what different colors might look better as a background. I really wasn't satisfied with this background, and so you might see me doing this a lot with the colors. So once I reach a point where I wanted to call this finished, what I do is duplicate all of those layers and then create a folder with them. And then I merge that layer that I just duplicated. There's definitely an easier way to do that. I could have just duplicated the layers and then merged them with the merge selected layers option, but I did it the very complicated way of grouping them before merging. And really, I could have just merged them all together to begin with instead of duplicating them. But the reason why I duplicate a lot of groups and layers is because I want to keep backups of them in case I decide that I don't like what I just did and I want to backtrack. And then one of the last things that I like to do before saving my piece is making it crisp and HD looking by using the sharpen tool. Sometimes the sharpen can look very drastic, so I actually duplicate it, sharpen that duplicated layer, and then edit the opacity depending on how severe I want the sharpened look to be. And then it's just time to save. I save it as a PNG. And there you have it. That is how I use Celsys Paint to create my illustrations. I really hope this video was helpful to some people out there, and I hope it wasn't like making you even more confused about the program. I tried my best, and I'm looking forward to making more mini tutorials about specific things in the future. But for now, thank you so much to Clipsio Paint for sponsoring this video. So remember, if you don't already use Clipsio Paint and you're interested in trying it out, there is a 3-month free trial available on their website. If you got here this far, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed it and learned something new today, and I will see you next time. Goodbye!